we're talking about velvet buck photos, having them in the summer, and does that really make a difference come fall when you're trying to get down to filling a tag?
I really do think that day one, being able to keep deer on this farm during the summer months is going to be better than what Area 52 was from the very beginning.
So you try to provide everything you can to keep them year round. That's always my goal. And if they're here in the summer, they're probably going to be here in the fall. I will get, some dispersal, but I don't get a lot on this farm.
Well, hey there everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Midwest Whitetail. We're very excited to be joining you on this Monday. We're standing in the month of June and it is a cold front day. That's why I'm wearing a hoodie, and it's just got the juices flowing thinking about the upcoming fall. You probably already are aware of what the topic of discussion is today based on the title of this video, but if not, we're talking about velvet buck photos, having them in the summer, and does that really make a difference come fall when you're trying to get down to filling a tag? We're going to be joining myself, Zach Rosmus, and Owen Riegler, who I would argue are all three in different hunting perspectives and different situations. So keep in mind as we go through this video that differing opinions are okay. And before I jump into where my thought processes are on the topic, if you're watching this video, I understand if you're watching it on the TV that it becomes a little bit cumbersome, but we would love for you to drop a comment and let us know your perspective on the topic. I mean, I know that we have a lot of different viewers from a lot of different states, and that could mean that you have different perspectives, and we're always trying to learn. This is just our observations, and ultimately one of the biggest caveats to this entire question is, what if you have a different opening day than Iowa? We are October 1st. If I was in a state like Kentucky or even Missouri, I really think I'd probably be answering these questions a touch differently. But you never could underestimate that somebody watching this, reading through those comment sections, could have the same situation as you. You can make a difference in their hunting. So if you have a perspective, let us know. But jumping into my answer on this question, do velvet buck photos matter? I'm gonna say no. And I'm not discounting that they do have value. I'll circle up at the end of it where I do personally believe this time of the year is super, super helpful. And there's a lot of things you can be paying attention to, but solely having a buck on the property is not where I feel like my mind drifts to at all. It does do two things for me, however. Number one, it confirms that a buck is alive, or it tells me that a buck is alive. Maybe I'm brand new on the property. Maybe it's a property I've had for multiple years. Either way, the excitement is now going higher. And with that excitement, I think what it does specifically for me is now all of a sudden my mind drifts to the hunting season. I feel like I'm in the game, but my mind's not necessarily focused on anything that's happening right now. I go to a map, especially if it's a new property, and I start to take a look at, how am I going to hunt this piece? What if he sticks around? What if his fall shift doesn't occur and he is in the general area? Because obviously that has happened. I'm sure many people get bucks in the summer and then they have them in the fall. And ultimately, you're going to hear Owen talk about this in his part of the segment, that, micro shifts do occur. And I think that every piece of property ultimately does influence what occurs, right? If you're in open country, bucks are going to go further. If you are in the big hardwoods, you may not ever have very good velvet photos in the first place. Like, there's so many different situations that you could find yourself in to answer this question, but I've tried to make it in my head as black and white as possible, and it's that I've never made a quote-unquote fall hunting decision based on the fact that I had a photo of a buck in a particular spot. All it told me was that, number one, he was alive, and number two, anything now that I'm excited to do, I probably should have already generated the excitement on my own to just try to hunt the property better. That would put me in a better position come fall. So, a couple of examples of this. Number one, I'm going to talk about where I'm standing right here. This is where big deer was. If you look behind me where I'm pointing, this is the cove I watched him in every single night. It was on command. I could drive out here, see him. The first time I saw him, I was like, my goodness, that's a giant buck. I'm excited to film him. But then, you know, trip 2 to trip 10, I really started thinking like, I really should try to find a way to hunt this deer. And ultimately, when it came down to the properties that I tried to get access on, knocking on, trying to call, this was my very last option. And you know, fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, this is the piece we ended up getting access to. And it yielded exactly what I would expect, which is that he did pop through here a few different times. He never did it in daylight based on what I could tell. Now granted, cameras don't tell the whole picture, but I was out here quite a bit. And ultimately based on where I did end up seeing him, you know, the point is he was in the area, it got me excited, but if I'm going into year 2 about how I'm gonna hunt that buck, it's not gonna have anything to do with the fact that this is where he summered. And so that would lead into another discussion on this whole velvet perspective, is that when I think about permission properties or a lease, things that I have limited options on the improvements I can make or my variables that are controllable, I am focusing all of my thought processes and improvements on the fall. I'm going to move now to the Big Bird property. I've had that permission piece for 2 years. You got it in July of 2023, right away, had great velvet bucks on it, was super excited going into the fall, and poof, they vanished. And you know, come rut, bucks did return, specifically drop time did. You know, 6x5 was very, very fringe, and I think now you're jumping into a social hierarchy discussion. But going into the season of 2024, I had velvet photos from, you know, I had photos of drop time from when he shed his antlers all the way through the month of August. And as I said, my opinion, every single plan that I made for him was based on what he did the previous fall. And what the velvet photos told me, what 2023 told me was, Big Bird property had everything that a buck wanted for the months of July, August, September, and then when that shift occurred, something was missing from what he wants in the fall. He comes back a few times for does, but most importantly, this is what you're gonna hear Zach and Owen talk about, I think that the food component's the biggest thing. The cover's not any less, the water access is not any less, but I did not have any green food. Once those beans defoliated, you saw a big dispersal, specifically from the bucks that I was trying to hunt. And ultimately what it did was give me a starting point of what am I really trying to work towards? And that's where I'm at in 2025. Big Bird property, I finally have access to put in some substantial food plots in some spots that I've really wanted to for the past few years. So I have to say a huge thank you to the landowners for having the opportunity to do that. The 6x5 buck is alive. Do I know that that's gonna make a change for him specifically? No, I don't. But I do know, and this is something you're gonna hear Owen say later in the episode, any improvement that I'm going to make today for the fall, it's gonna help the property. It's just gonna help and elevate the hunting. Maybe it helps with 6x5, maybe it doesn't. But again, going back to any improvements that I've been trying to make on the Big Bird property or this property, it's all based on my fall historic information. And you know, maybe someday if I'm able to achieve buying land, will I have a different perspective? It's possible. Would I put in money and time into trying to, you know, have all season food sources? Absolutely. You know, if it's my dirt and I can, you know, have endless freedoms to where I can make changes or test things, I'm absolutely going to do that. But on a permission piece, the number one thing I'm doing is trying to respect the landowner. I don't want to be too intrusive. Number two, I'm more concerned about, you know, building my relationship with them so that I can do the things in the first place in the fall. So maybe over time, I'll be able to make the improvements that hold the bucks longer in the summer. You know, that's something you're gonna hear Zach and Owen talk about. They don't want them to leave. But right now where I'm at, having velvet photos is very important. I think that if you run a camera on the bean edge and you get a giant buck on there, that is super important. It gives you a starting place. Big deer is my greatest example of that. Had I never found him, I would never have ended up hunting here. I never would have been in the process of door knocking and driving around and trying to do all these different things that gave me a chance at hunting the buck of a lifetime. I also would go a step further and say that running cameras at this time of the year has a lot to offer you outside of those singular photos on a food source. I love to put cameras out on the best trails, creek crossings, places that there's very clear historical and current sign. Maybe it's a location where there's historical rubs, community scrapes. You know, one of the examples I would use is that on Big Bird property, I have the hawk crossing that I put up a conquest rope scent that is been hit since the month of December. You know, through shedding, does are hitting it still today. Bucks, when they're in the particular area, they hit it. They're not necessarily pawing at the ground, but I'm learning a lot about the consistency of doe movement and just deer movement in general. And I would say there's a really good example of a trail on that property where all year it is the exact same movement. Doesn't matter what food sources have changed, the deer are doing the exact same thing. So point is, expand your horizons. You know, if you get the big buck photo, don't rely solely on it. And if you don't get the photo of them, there's nothing to be discouraged about there either. I mean, it's going to be something that just tells you you have some opportunities to give them maybe more of what they would want during the summer. Now, if you're limited to acreage, right? Because I think that that's another big part of this discussion. As you listen to Zach and Owen talk about this, you kind of see what I mean. But if you're limited to acreage, I'm going to be most concerned to make my property as good as it can be during the time of year in which I can hunt them. And so being in Iowa, that means, you know, late September through the rest of the year, all of my thoughts, they go to what information I have, historic trail cams, historic encounters, observations, whatever it is. That's where my time's going to, that's where my money's going to. And with all that being said, now what I'm gonna go do is go put out trail cameras on this property. I'm gonna go see if big deer's alive. There was also that buck from October I'd love to see. Now granted, there's an example. I ran cameras here for quite a long time. He didn't show up till September 30th. So there's a lot of potential for the upcoming season. I'm very, very thankful for all the opportunities through landowners that I've gotten to be excited for this coming fall. And without further ado, we're gonna jump to Zach. Please, again, let us know what you guys think as you're watching this episode. We'd love to hear your opinions, and thanks for watching.
All right, velvet bucks, and do they matter from a hunting perspective? This is a tough question. I think we're gonna get a lot of different perspectives on this one, and I'm interested to hear what the guys have to say about this. For my answer, I'm gonna say no, they don't matter. And I'm gonna say that from a landowner's perspective and also just drawing from my hunting experience, because I remember those first few months of owning Area 52 and putting up my Cuddy Link system and just seeing, you know, very little buck photos that were coming through. And you know, Area 52 was a predominantly timber tract. And during the summer months, you know, when I really started to think about it, when I took a step back, the deer don't want to be there during the summer months. You know, there's a lot of insects, and that plays a huge role with that velvet being so sensitive during the summer months, during this time of the year. Mosquitoes, black flies, the midges, you know, in those locations. So they're going to be really heavy this time of the year. So it makes sense that they want to gravitate towards areas where there's going to be less bugs, more open areas, more prairie, field edges, that type of stuff. So as I was working through, you know, different ways that I could enhance my property down there, I don't want the deer to leave, right? I want them to stay there. You know, I want to make sure that I can make my farm as best as possible where they don't have to leave. Alfalfa played a huge role in that, and I definitely saw through that time that I kept more deer on the farm having a green food source like that, because when I zoomed out and looked at the map, you know, I didn't see a lot of green food sources in my area. And so I identified as that as a way where I could make my farm better. And then I think the pond played into that too. You know, anytime you can incorporate different water sources on your property, that way they don't have to leave just to get a drink of water, and being able to keep deer on your farm during the summer months. So with that information in hand, you know, coming from Area 52, obviously I bought the homestead this spring. And I really do think that day one, being able to keep deer on this farm during the summer months is going to be better than what Area 52 was from the very beginning. There's just more open area. You know, we do have the 30 acres of CRP, 40 acres of row crop, and that's going to be an area where they want to spend time for a predominant food source during the summer months. And then also it's area, you got the breezes out there, not going to be as many insects. So I really do think day one, I'm going to be able to hold those deer, and you might have more resident bucks during the summer months that are going to be there in the fall, because I know that it's a farm, you know, with a creek system, you know, hardwoods, you know, the southern Iowa vibe, where the bucks are going to be there because it's a transition corridor. So I know they're going to be there in the fall. I also just think I'm going to keep them during the summer a little bit more. And as I identify, you know, no different than any property, how can I enhance it to make it better? You know, incorporating green food sources is going to be a key theme in how can I enhance the homestead moving forward. And that's one of the most recent projects I've been working on down there, is that I've actually been able to incorporate 2 acres or close to 2 acres of some new plots, with the idea that there's going to be a central green food source, potentially clover, chicory, alfalfa, having that central food source where you have that green to green transition right in the center of the farm, I think is going to really allow me to have a location where, one, I can sit on the edge of it and get some velvet bucks during the summer, but also I'm bringing everything in through the center of the farm. You know, I don't want them to have to leave. If I can have that incorporated right on the edge of the row crop, to me, that's going to set me up for success moving forward on the homestead. And as I kind of work my way through this process, you know, I'm already adding, you know, 5 and 6, you know, different food plots on year 1, which I really think is going to play into how that farm is going to hunt and also how I'm going to protect wildlife moving forward. As I'm working my way through answering this question, you know, I'm thinking about my perspective. You know, I'm a landowner here in southern Iowa, and I can definitely see how you could give different perspectives on this because depending where you're located in the country, you could have an earlier opener in September months where, you know, if you see that buck during August, you know, type of thing, I would definitely make a mental note of that, you know, and that could be, you know, early enough where their summer range might be, you know, pretty close to where their fall range is going to be. I'm just thinking that I'm not hinging my entire season right now on that one buck photo. And I say that as somebody that I run my Cuddy Link system on a year-round basis. I just think that identifying different camera locations is just as much fun during the summer months as it is during the fall, where I have a lot of camera locations where I do leave them on a community scrape. Although the bucks during this time of the year, they're not aggressively working those scrape locations. Every single deer that walks by those community scrapes, they're checking it out really quick. It might just be that one photo, you know, just really quickly, hey, who's in the area, what's going on? You'll see that a lot of us are transitioning our cameras onto water hole sources, mineral, depending on where you're located in the actual country, and then also just locations transitioning out to food sources this time of the year. So this is my perspective on it. You know, I don't think I'm gonna hinge my entire season on it, you know, like getting that intel right now, but it definitely would get me excited to have a big buck on camera. Next, we're gonna kick it over to Owen, and I'm really excited to hear his perspective on it because as somebody that's really early on in my land ownership career, I really emulate a lot of the stuff that Owen has done with his property. It's been a privilege of mine that I've been able to go over there sometimes, and even just being able to have knowledge about what he's done to that property over the years. I think he's gonna have a unique perspective on this answer, so I'm really looking forward to hearing what Owen has to say about this one.
Well, that was interesting hearing from the guys, you know, about this question, do velvet picks even matter? The short answer is I'm going to say yes. I can think of numerous occasions where I was getting summer photos of a buck. Loch Ness comes to mind right away. Once you start getting photos of them, now you're dreaming and scheming, what can I do to set the area up, make it the best possible to keep him right there in that area. And it's worked on numerous occasions, you know, the Loch Ness buck, wide 9, picket fence. There's been a lot of them, but you know, those have all been bucks that have been there the previous fall as well, so you had that intel to go off as far as, you know, trying to keep all your plots the same or your row crop, whatever, try and keep that the same. The more you can do that, I think the more they act the same the following year. Now, that being said, I think you're always going to have some years where, or every year really, where some deer leave. You're not going to keep all the bucks. Where they go and why they go there, I mean, that's kind of up to discussion. I think they go back to their birth range most of the time when they're leaving the farm, they're going someplace. Just a lot of times it's not even food related. They're going past good food, they're going through good cover to get to wherever they're going. So there's got to be a reason they're going to that spot. And birth range comes to mind for me. I think that's where they're going. So I mean, you could take like Genesis as an example. He summers like 2.5 miles away and then always makes it back to the farm every year. Another buck that's pretty interesting is this Houdini buck. You know, he was on the farm all the time up until about 4.5, I think was the summer he left, or that fall. He was there during the summer, and when he was 4.5 years old, he left, and he comes back every year, and why he leaves, where he goes, it's definitely not food related, because I've got everything he could ever want. And I'm sure that, you know, your age structure and your herd dynamic plays into that as well, you know. If you've got a lot of mature bucks, you're probably going to have some fall dispersal just because, you know, when a buck gets to 4 or 5 years old, he wants to be dominant in his area. So he's moving out to an area where there isn't a dominant buck. So you see that sometimes as well. What I try to do on this farm is to keep them all year long. So I'll have my summer food sources. Clover, alfalfa, soybeans are your main food sources. Plus I've got a lot of browse, you know, I'm always fixing up the farm. So you try to provide everything you can to keep them year round. That's always my goal, And if they're here in the summer, they're probably going to be here in the fall. I will get, some dispersal, but I don't get a lot on this farm. Now, I've had other farms where it feels like the dispersal is just related to terrain. I had a hill farm. This was where I lived for probably 10 years west of here a ways. And in the summer, that farm would be just void of bucks for the most part. I mean, they might come in for a day or two, whatever, but later I acquired the farm to the east of it, and it was a lot of river bottom, row crop, and stuff like that. And we found out the bucks weren't that far away. They were just down on that river bottom, a quarter-mile away. It's a little bit cooler. It's more wide open, and I think that's another takeaway too. Like even on my home farm, where they're generally here all year, there are these micro shifts. They're in the summer, they're probably in more open areas, more ag-related. They're not in the thick stuff where that's going to be hitting their velvet. I would guess that's pretty sensitive. They don't like stuff touching their velvet. And so I see these micro shifts. Maybe they moved 200 or 300 yards, and that's where they're living right there in the summer. But you can bank, they're not going to be too far from that. If you know right where they're at in the summer, look at the closest good thick cover, where they can get kind of back away from the fawns and the does. If you start looking at that, that's probably where they're going to end up, most of the fall. For a takeaway, I would say there's a lot of validity to these photos that, right during the summer. I know a lot of guys are like, oh, I don't care, what's there right now. They're not going to be there come fall, but that's just not always the case. And I've found that more times than not, what you're seeing in the summer is the same buck you're hunting in the fall. And like I said before, I've had that numerous times and a lot of different bucks that we've killed. So I would take that into account, and if you're getting one right now, try and set up your farm for him. Hey, if he leaves, you're not out anything. You improved an area for another buck that may move in. Now you may have a different farm that's just completely different dynamics. They all leave for whatever reason, and I'm gonna make it food related, hoping they come back for food. I mean, that's always my goal, is just to keep them here year round. So that's my take on it, and once again, guys, I appreciate you joining us, and we'll see you right back here on the next one.
Hey, Chris Respis out here with Blue, walking this awesome property, Hunter's Paradise, here in eastern North Carolina. Turnkey, 200-acre, loaded with all sorts of game: ducks, deer, turkeys, and trophy black bear. Why don't you come and check this out? Growing up here in eastern North Carolina, I have duck hunted all of this area, including this particular farm in the past, where you can kill black ducks, teal, mallards, pintails, and divers. The deer hunting throughout this area is very good. The black bear hunting is the best in the world. Some of the largest black bears ever killed were killed in this county of North Carolina on the coast. Access on a property like this is very important, because there are places that do not have the access that this property has. The owner has put trails throughout the property with deer stands, food plots, and many accesses to the water, to where you can either fish from the bank or put a small boat over. Has over a mile of waterfront. Right where I'm standing, we're only a quarter of a mile from the Pamlico Sound, and this area is very much on the coast. You have many access points through the inlets of the Outer Banks of North Carolina to access the Atlantic Ocean. Hey guys, I know this property well. I've been around here my whole life. This is a gem of a hunting property. Somebody's gonna have a great opportunity to have a sportsman paradise. If you would like to see it, just give me a holler. I'd be happy to show it to you.